everybody. Welcome to the latest in Pelgrane Press's virtual panel series, which is Cthulhu and gaming. We're trying initially to sort of hit the big topics, and what could be bigger than good old Cthulhu? So we are going to talk today about Cthulhu and gaming. And I thought first we would have the panelists introduce themselves. I am a moderator slash panelist. My name is Robin D. Laws. My most Cthulhu-y credits are various scenarios for a Trail of Cthulhu, which is based on my gumshoe system, and most notably Dreamhounds of Paris, and contributions to the Shadows over Filmland series, among other things. And we have brought in a special ringer, a special guest, someone who's a close personal friend of Cthulhu in her capacity as a Chaosium line editor. Lynne Hardy, please introduce yourself.
Hello, as Robin said, I'm Lynne Hardy. I'm the associate editor for Call of Cthulhu at Chaosium. I was line editor for the Modiphius Acton Cthulhu Kickstarter project as well. Having dabbled on and off for far longer than I really want to admit in the murky world of the Great Tentacled One.
Next we have Cthulhuid expert extraordinaire and designer of Trail of Cthulhu, the gumshoe adaptation of Call of Cthulhu, Kenneth Hite. Introduce yourselves and yourself and your many other multi-tentacled credits.
Yeah, I'm Kenneth Hite. I'm a game designer and writer. Trail of Cthulhu is my pinnacle Cthulhuvian achievement, is that it's the gumshoe adaptation of Sandy's magnificent Call of Cthulhu. Most recently, in the Cthulhu space in games, I've done Fall of Delta Green for Pelgrane and was a co-author on the Delta Green role-playing game for Mark Dream. Both of those bring Cthulhu into the murky and hellish eldritch non-Euclidean universe of government bureaucracies and fight all of them. Fall of Delta Green set in the 1960s, regular Delta Green set in the now. The other Cthulhuoid thing that has been occupying my mind is my book Tour to Lovecraft the Destinations, which we are in the process of converting to all of its various ePubly forms. The text is done, the art is done, the maps are done, the back cover is done. Everything is done except for the formatting part. And so that will be released anytime now.
And next up we have Gareth Ryder-Hanrahan. Show your face and reveal your tentacled allegiances.
Yeah, I'm Gareth Hanrahan. I've written a bunch of Cthulhu bits for Pelgrane. The biggest one would probably be Cthulhu City. With other Cthulhuid hats on, I was the line manager for Cubicle 7's now defunct Laundry Files line. And I've run Cthulhu at WarpCon, so local convention, every year since 1997, which is an alarming track record, and one I really hope will be broken this year, but I fear it will be.
You honestly can't be old enough, Gar.
Yes, there may be greater events afoot, world-ending events that prevent you from continuing your streak. So what we're going to do is we're going to kick around some basic questions about how Lovecraft's Cthulhu Mythos and tabletop role-playing game intersect. And then when we run out of obvious things to say, we will call upon you, our beloved audience, at this virtual seminar for questions. And when that happens, I'll ask you to use the raise hands feature, which is, I believe, part of the chat button down at the bottom of your exciting Zoom window there. And so I thought I'd start off. Some people will be watching this later on YouTube, perhaps people who've typed in the words Cthulhu and gaming into a YouTube search engine, and they might be trying to figure out just what the whole deal is with this altogether. Why is Cthulhu peanut butter to gaming's jelly? What is so, Lynne? What should people expect, what to probably are most of the people watching this now with us already know about what a Cthulhu role-playing experience is like.
Well, the first thing, hopefully, is that it's fun. You get together with your friends to create a story of cosmic horror, investigative horror, but it doesn't just have to be investigation, although that tends to be sort of like what most people think of first when they hear Call of Cthulhu and Trailer Cthulhu, because of course from horror films and horror novels we know that there are lots and lots of different genres. So you could have your gritty drama horror, you can have your pulpy adventure horror, you can have your real core mystery and investigative horror. Really, to have a good game of Cthulhu, your keeper and your players need to know the sort of horror that you're interested in and the sort of horror that you enjoy, so that you can make sure you're getting the most out of it. And after it's nearly 40 years now of Cthulhu gaming in various different forms, there's an awful lot out there to help support you to get that great gaming experience in the genre of horror that you really most enjoy. The key thing is fun and telling a story with your friends.
So Ken, the particular flavor of fun that people are going to experience when they play a Cthulhu-based game has certain particular elements to that, and of course they come from the game that Lynne works on, the granddaddy of them all in a lot of ways, and that would be Sandy Peterson's Call of Cthulhu. You have grappled with this game for many years. I believe it is your favorite game. And you adapted it specifically to Trail of Cthulhu. So Trail is not just another game that uses the Cthulhu mythos, which is largely in the public domain, but rather specifically adapts Sandy's design choices to our in-house investigative game system. So I wonder if you could speak first of all to that history. Why is Call of Cthulhu an important design? And secondly, what are the essential elements of it that you identified that had to be ported over to the Gumshoe version?
Call of Cthulhu came out in 1981. Sandy Peterson, who was a young game designer then, as opposed to a suspiciously young game designer, which is what he is now. Sandy designed Call of Cthulhu using the RuneQuest game system, the basic role-playing as it would later be christened. And the big difference between RuneQuest and other role-playing game systems at that time was that RuneQuest gloried in the fragility of its characters. You could randomly chop off your arm in a combat a lot. Characters never got into the multiple tens of hit points. They pretty much stuck around 20 would be a good day. So the characters were inherently weak, and that turned out to be one of the great core elements of Call of Cthulhu as Sandy designed it, that the characters are weak and easily destroyed by the entities, the Cthulhu mythos, and its dangerous monsters and gods that it unleashed. And in addition to the physical weakness, Sandy's great addition was the sanity point death spiral, in which characters became mentally damaged by dealing with the Cthulhu mythos, as their grip on reality was shredded by their exposure to the greater and more terrifying reality of the Cthulhu mythos. And since the resource with which to fight the Cthulhu mythos was sanity, you got yourself in a position where the further you got into the fight, the worse you got at fighting and the more danger you exposed yourself to. And that single central act of self-sacrifice became the arc of Call of Cthulhu, in the same way that the act of murdering orcs and taking all their stuff was the central arc of Dungeons and Dragons. So where one game made you more powerful, Call of Cthulhu made you less powerful, which was a offer that you accepted in exchange for knowledge, the knowledge of the horrors of the outside world, thus recapitulating the investigative structure of the scenarios that Sandy also teased out of Lovecraft's fiction. And so those sort of core elements, weak characters who disintegrate in contact with the Cthulhu mythos, and a core activity of investigating the Cthulhu mythos, sort of is what Cthulhu gaming began as in 1981, and even very shortly thereafter, Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, and Sandy added a lot of pulp, globe-trotting exploration to the game, so it became RuneQuest with machine guns, and there was nothing whatsoever wrong with that either. That was great. I played a lot of that in the early 80s, and but the core mythos of self-sacrifice of a damaged, wounded character remained the core activity of all Cthulhu games, or almost all Cthulhu games, down from 1981 to present. And I certainly was cognizant of that when we did the Gumshoe adaptation, Trail of Cthulhu, that you have to make sure that characters are in legitimate danger of being destroyed mentally and or physically in any adventure, and that the ability to counter that destruction always comes at the price of accepting further destruction. And in terms of the gameplay, what that means is you are walking in not with the mentality of I can beat this, but the mentality of what horrible thing will happen to me. And that mentality, of course, accelerates the atmosphere of horror around the table and the general sense of nervousness and dread is maybe too strong a word, but strong concern for your character's outcome. And that is, of course, the fundamental basics of horror. It's why Sandy's design was a magnificent King Lear level design from the jump, and why it remains at the core of all great Cthulhu role-playing, and indeed all role-playing that isn't about simple power fantasy.
Now, Gar, you cut your teeth designing and running convention scenarios, and I think Cthulhu gaming has a special place in the convention environment, especially a smaller convention where typically there'll be a lot of D&D, and that's becoming as true now as it ever was. And then very often the next biggest sort of type of game will be either Call of Cthulhu or these days possibly some other flavor of Cthulhu game. But I think people who gravitate toward those are looking for a certain experience that's different from the D&D play style. As Ken has already mentioned, one of the things about that is the lethality of the game, that you are in one you're expected to kill the monsters and succeed, and in the other often you're expected to enjoy horribly dying, even more so in a con run than in a campaign style run. So when you are sitting down to create a convention scenario, what gamer expectations are you setting out to fulfill, and that you would suggest that other people designing scenarios for conventions would fulfill?
Well, the great thing about the Cthulhu mythos is that the horror can be lurking anywhere. You can kick over any stone and mythos could conceivably be lurking behind it, which means you can take pretty much any setting, any location, any almost like concept, and put groovy tentacles and cultists and monsters behind it. And you can take, you can have like, a group in an Antarctic research base. You could have like secondhand book dealers in London. You could have the crew of a freighter. You could have the crew of a starship. I mean, Alien is a Cthulhu scenario. You could have a small baby walking into a seminar. Sorry.
Oh no, the horror!
I know.
I'm not in that form.
Sorry about this. Where was I? The other great thing about Cthulhu for conventions is that the mystery can be one the players can solve. For a regular scenario, or for a regular mystery, the players have prove it where the law is involved. The players have to prove it to the unreasonable doubt. Whereas a Cthulhu scenario, they just find the ritual that will banish the hideous monster. I will truncate that answer and deposit this creature somewhere else.
So, Lynn, when you are looking at scenarios that people submit to Chaosium, what are the things that you most often notice that you're going to want to change or adjust in order to make them better fit the Call of Cthulhu ethos and game system?
The main one is ensuring that the investigators have agency to do something. Quite often, particularly novice writers, forget that they're not writing a story or providing a framework for other people to create a story. So you've got to remember to leave that space in there for people to add their own twists, find how they find things, that their decisions as players have an effect on how the story develops. So that's one of the absolute main things that we always look for is, do the players have the opportunity to influence the story and where it goes? The other one is there, are there any gigantic leaps of logic anywhere in there? Because with the best will in the world, when you're writing something, what you think you've written, that isn't necessarily what you've actually written down. Particularly if you're transcribing something that you've run at a convention or you've run for friends, because you're filling in holes in the background that you don't necessarily realize are holes until you write it down and give it to somebody else to play. So those are the two key things, that the agency and is there a continuum plot stream through here that doesn't require any gigantic leaps of logic for the players to spontaneously appear in a location rather than because they have to, and there hasn't been anything that's given them any real information on why they're there or how to get there.
Now, Lynn's 2 points, which are agency and make sure that it makes sense, are both super important to any investigative game, and therefore the first principles for an investigative game like Call of Cthulhu or Trail of Cthulhu. But Ken, what would you add to specifically create the atmosphere of cosmic horror that separates Lovecraft not just from writers in other genres, but other horror writers?
With Lovecraft or with Lovecraftian horror, the cosmicism at some point gets built up from small revelations that in the ideal world and in some of Lovecraft's stories can still be passed off as hoaxes or delusions or lies. And it is the sort of revelation of a larger shape of the horror, something that is not just one haunted house with one ghost in it. And again, that's a terrific adventure. It has been a terrific adventure since it was the first thing I ever played in Call of Cthulhu in 1981. But the revelation has to be that, there's more to this. There's a bigger a world out there, a malign world, or at the very least a world so powerful that just brushing up against it destroys you, whether it's malign or not. And it's that act of revelation of things outside your knowledge that is sort of the core to Lovecraftian and cosmic horror. And again, Lovecraft wrote plenty of stories that are just basically, there's a bunch of monsters in a tunnel, let's kill them. That is not, Lovecraft himself is not always writing cosmic horror, so you can, be in the spirit of Lovecraft and write plenty good haunted house stories or ghoul fight in a tunnel stories. But for the sort of the pure quill, you have to present a world that is both larger and less rational than the world that the characters operate in. And that can be through strange events that are happening, sort of weird spoor, inexplicable aspects of physics or biology, things where the fringes of science run right into a thing that can't happen, but is nonetheless happening, and is happening in a way that is dangerous or deleterious to the characters or to the town around them, whatever it is that they're there to solve. You can present it as extending infinitely far back into history or into paleontology if you're finding like fossils of the creature that you're fighting, and you recognize that our notions of the age of the universe and the relevance of mankind get turned on their tail. Any sort of presentation of a horror moment, ideally the horror moments all lead to this notion of a larger force, a larger bunch of entities, a larger physics than we understand, and then we can give those physics cool names like Yog-Sothoth and Cthulhu and Azathoth and whatever else. And it is that sort of grounding in the neo-Gothic or the black magical or whatever you want to call it that makes Call of Cthulhu horror, and the specific flavor of horror that it is, this sort of enormous scientized Gothic, as opposed to just science fiction with some extraordinarily weird, black hole or something.
So, Gar, I'm going to ask you now what your, I think I know the answer, what your favorite element of the Lovecraftian mythos is, and how someone might go about using that in a scenario.
See, I'm not sure if I have a favorite. I have a favorite monster, as we established in that in the Pelgrane video. But I mean, I think my actual favorite element of the mythos is actually Cthulhu himself. Just the concept of this massive influence on all human history. That's like, this sort of psychic singularity that's been like pulling at us, and it's like affecting all of us, and it's so vast and awful that we can really like detect it in like the imprints it leaves on culture and so forth, unless you happen to like wash up on the wrong island at the wrong time. And in terms of how I would use that in a game, for like using Cthulhu himself in a game, I would for stiff around the edges, like deal with the Cthulhu cult and to hint to the footprints of this monster as opposed to having it show up directly.
So, Lynn, your favorite element of the mythos and how you might use that in a scenario?
I think Ken's already covered it to a certain extent. It's the fact that it might be just something normal. It might just be a perfectly rational explanation, but then again, it might not. And how much of that are you prepared to admit to yourself? How much of that are you prepared to admit to the world around you? So it's that, it's one of the principles Stephen Moffat, has milked dramatically for Doctor Who over the years, is that even something normal can be terrifying and horrific, and you can layer the mythos onto it and under it, and that's one of my favorite elements.
Ken, and do you have a favorite a specific a chunk of the mythos that you would weave into a scenario?
I'm with Gar very much. I like the fact that Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth or the existence of the mythos warps human history and leaves its spoor or its footprints behind. So I'm a big fan of, the mysterious cult that flared up in 16th century Germany and vanished and no one knew what happened to it, or the weird Fortean event that was seen over that the skies of Manitoba in 1880 and now is somehow coming back again. That these little echoes or ripples in the pond of human experience are the sign of some giant monster underneath the lake. I'm a big fan. I mean, that's part of why Gar and I think, work so well together as writers and designers, is we have that very same sensibility that if you can see, human society or art or culture or politics being deformed by this, and even if you never, have to admit to yourself as a player that, it's a monster from the Jurassic that's doing it, but the deformity and the changes are still put together sort of an invisible pattern. I like the sort of conspiracy theory turned on its head quality of Cthulhu, where you present all of these weird unpleasant things, and rather than jumping to some lame human conspiracy, you jump directly to, oh, it's a vast cosmic force, and it's just the cussed way the universe operates. Once you understand it, that quality of literally insane reasoning from this is odd that this church has been abandoned for 100 years to, oh right, Nyarlathotep is real. That's just a great sort of both intellectual and a cosmic moment, and I like that quality of Lovecraft, that it's tied in with those things.
I'm hearing a lot of motifs being mentioned, so I'm going to name a specific object that is crucial to the Lovecraftian stories, and that is the Necronomicon, the book of horror that has been translated multiple times and is just bad news to have around, and that the cultists are always trying to get a hold of. The reason I'm going to name that is not just because it is evocative and the backstory of it is highly suggestive and horrific, but also that it makes a great MacGuffin. That you can say that for a convention scenario, a copy of the Necronomicon has surfaced, and you either have it and are trying to keep it away from the people who want to get it, or it has been taken by the people who shouldn't have it. And, either way, that it gives you an immediate premise for a scenario. It and also suggests the possibility of the scene in which you, the player characters, are tempted to open it up and see what's inside, and have your minds irretrievably scattered by it. So when Lovecraft himself uses the Necronomicon a whole lot, and so you, as a keeper of a Cthulhu role-playing game, I think should have no compunction about overusing that particularly exciting trope either. And so before we move on to questions, since this is an introductory panel, there is always an issue that you have to deal with Lovecraft, which is that like virtually everyone else who is a foundational figure in creating the original adventure and pulp structures that we are familiar with today and that animate most popular culture in the West, he wrote in a time of overt racism. He was himself an overt racist, even more so in his letters and personal correspondence than in the stories. So Lynn, how do we throw out that bathwater and keep the baby of what is interesting about cosmic horror? How do we ameliorate that element of Lovecraft's thought that seeped its way into his writing?
Well, the first thing is you have to acknowledge it. We can't pretend that it didn't happen, because that's way worse than the fact that it did happen. You have to understand where it came from and, acknowledge it. But the thing to remember is that the Cthulhu mythos was, from its very earliest days, a shared world. It wasn't just Lovecraft creating the stories, or a whole load of other authors in there creating things. And the thing that we can take is that it's not their world anymore, it's our world. We are now the ones creating those stories, so we can do better. We know better, we should be doing better, we can do better to move it away from that. Know where it came from, do our best not to repeat the mistakes of the past.
And I think on that note, it's time to open things up for questioning. So I'm told that the raise hands feature is in participants if you're using this on a desktop, or it's hidden away in the more feature if you're on mobile. And let us start with Paul Stefko. I don't think we've had a Paul Stefko question in one of these panels yet, so let's start with you.
Oh, right out of the gate. Okay. My question is, in long-term play, how do you balance the entire point of the mythos of the cosmic nihilism with actually maintaining players' suspension of disbelief that they keep actually making forward progress against the mythos?
I would say that for a long-term play situation, the first thing that you need to have is backup characters for everybody, so that, and that's not just the practical use of the GM, but it's also, it puts the players in the right mindset. That this is not about husbanding Larry the private detective through 84 adventures with Cthulhu. This is about expanding the knowledge of the group or the player sort of team as a whole. And if Larry, buys it in the next cemetery, that's great. His plucky secretary Sandra is right there. She's got all of his notebooks, and she's been, taking martial arts classes and can come right out and help with the investigation. And so you have a plausible in-universe reason for the next bullet to get slotted into that gun. Delta Green obviously solves it by having the government assign you partners, and so when you die or are maimed, the government just sends new meat into the fight. So you can have a system like that where you've got a sponsor, or you're part of a secret society that's all working together against the Mythos, or you can just have the plausible human connections that draw you in, as indeed in Derleth's novel The Trail of Cthulhu, from where I took the title of the game. The second thing is that suspension of disbelief is an individual thing at the table, and some tables are going to respond really well if everything that they encounter is a aspect of one specific entity, so that you don't have to multiply. Do I have to believe in Azathoth and Nyarlathotep and Cthulhu and Yagalanak and Sathagwa? This is ridiculous. There's like a million of these things. Maybe it's all just Sathagwa in your game, or all Azathoth, or whatever. And the spirals and the bits of it may have individual names, but as they piece the pieces together, they recognize that there is some sort of unity to it. Other groups will have no trouble believing in a vast malign universe filled with also competing malign entities, because that's the universe that we actually live in. So they won't have a problem of saying, you mean there's 4 oil companies? I don't buy it. There's 4 Cthulhu monsters. I get that. That makes sense. So it's very much about maintaining the scope, and then at core moments revealing enough of the new scope that the player characters and the players, ideally, will reel back and say, oh my God, this is bigger than we thought. And if you can do that to people who've already read Lovecraft, that's the triumph, right? Because if you've read Lovecraft, you've skipped to the end, you know that everything is bigger than you thought. That's the whole point. But in the game, to have a moment where the players are like, oh, dinosaurs, I didn't want to go back to dinosaur times. That's a great moment that you can do. And because, as Lynn and Gar were saying, the mythos is everywhere and everywhen. Every kind of story you want to tell can feed into it. So you're not doing, oh, this is Haunted House number 9, the way that it might be if you were doing an M.R. James game, where it's basically just churches and houses with ghosts in. That's all you got. But in a Cthulhu universe game, you can have churches and houses with ghosts in, plus ghouls, plus aliens from Pluto, plus cults, plus the Necronomicon, plus all of the stuff. And just that degree of variety will keep a long-term campaign going as well.
It's also down to pacing too. Obviously, how and when you introduce those elements will vary massively between a convention game, something that's going to last you 2 or 3 sessions, and a long campaign is the sort of like the slow drip, drip, drip of realization in a campaign, building slowly to that big reveal at the end of it.
Players who are very concerned about suspension of disbelief are an interesting breed, because of course you've all sat down and presumably you've agreed to play, in this case, in a universe that contains Lovecraftian cosmic horror and ghouls and dreamland and all of these things that are overtly fantastical. Likewise, if you're playing Star Trek, you've all agreed to play in a world where warp speed exists, and most aliens you meet are essentially humanoid. They look like people with prosthetic makeup on and so forth. And the person who likes to pick at those things is, I I think someone who often is kind of embarrassed about the kind of stuff they like. It's not like having concerns about realism drives them to go and read literary fiction about faculty politics. They still are into Cthulhu in this case, but I think they just want to have that acknowledged. So I think what you can do is sort of out of character say, well, of course, this is a literary conceit that makes the story work, is that, yes, you're going to get to play another character. So why don't we acknowledge that as players and have you as the character explain why you're here, come up with a fun reason to come along, or whatever the disbelief issue is. And I think those people just want to sort of quickly acknowledge that they're smarter, they think, than the material that they love. So let them have that moment of irony and then move on. And I think often you can tie yourself in knots trying to worry about suspension of disbelief in something where that whole concept is actually completely absurd. So let's, now I see there's another question that almost got asked that's in the chat that I think is still worth bringing up. Michael, Susio, do you want to pop on and pose that question?
Well, I think Paul almost duplicated what I would have asked. What I find often happens is pretty quickly people just say, oh, well, I'm going to go crazy, so I'm pulling out my machine gun and mowing down everybody on the street. They might be cultists. It's just, if that happens after 10 sessions of slow unwinding horror, that's great. If it's after 2 sessions, then something is not quite going the way I would expect or hope.
So I guess the question can be framed as what to do with players who are there in order to go berserk, that they are looking to, the lure of irresponsibility in role-playing games is already great. That's something people love in D&D. Let's start a fight in the bar. Let's try and kill the count who is assigning us our mission. How do you deal with the fantasy of irresponsibility in role-playing so that it actually remains within the genre and the characters aren't doing things that are totally outside what Lovecraftian characters would do?
Well, if they want to go kill crazy, definitely play a pulp style game. Make it part of the world that they do have those Tommy guns. They can go and do that. Because every now and again, people, even in something like Call of Cthulhu, Trail of Cthulhu, they do just want to let off steam. And again, that's part of the communication between the keeper and their players is, are you in the mood for angsty, drama-driven investigation tonight? Or do you just want to go blow up some deep ones? And every now and again, you do just want to get the dynamite and go blow up some deep ones, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
I think another thing to do is make sure the players can actually make, or feel like they're making some progress. Like, if there's if you present them with an unsolvable cosmic mystery, then the player will go, right, nothing I can do, may as well shoot stuff. But if the players are going like, okay, as a player, I know that there is no hope and the Mythos will doom us all. But my character really wants to find out, what happened to that temple in 1829, or what did happen to my old friend who wrote me this letter just before he vanished. Basically, let them progress a bit in the mystery each session, as opposed to just give them a wall they can't get over.
And I'd say that the 0th rule is just talk to your players. Lynn sort of mentioned that, but I would say even specifically in this case, if you've got if the same player is always bringing out the machine guns when it's sneaking time, or in other ways leaning into being a psychopath, and the game's not about that, then ask them what's their story and why are they ruining the game for everybody else. And if they don't have a useful explanation or a sincere promise of amendment, don't invite them to play Call of Cthulhu. There's lots of games that they will enjoy and you will enjoy playing with them. Maybe they're just not set up for Cthulhu games. Not everyone in the world likes, Mexican food. If you got your friend who's violently allergic to cilantro, you don't bring him to a Mexican restaurant. You got your friend who's violently allergic to being serious for an hour, don't bring him to Call of Cthulhu.
Now, there's another classic problem of Cthulhu gaming, of players not doing their part in acting like characters in their genre. And it's one that Trail of Cthulhu solves by giving the characters drives, which are reasons why you act like a horror character. Surprisingly often, in a Call of Cthulhu game, you will find all sorts of players who get so into being scared that it's like, well, we're not going to go down into the ghoul tunnel. We're not going to get on that plane. We're not going to open this document that has the clue in it, but also might have a terrifying sigil that will scramble our sense of human primacy in the universe. We're just going to stay at home. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? So if you aren't using Trail of Cthulhu and using a drive, is there another answer to that question, Lynn, than just saying, you're playing a Call of Cthulhu character, of course you go and open the book or go on the plane?
I must have been incredibly fortunate, because I think I've actually come across that once where someone was absolutely resolutely determined not to do anything. And again, it's expectations of what you're coming to a game for, and they obviously expected something very different to what we were doing. You talk to them. Why are they not engaging? Why is there something about the story that they're not interested in? Are they using their character as an excuse to not engage with it? Is it not the sort of tone that they were expecting? You know, why are they refusing to do this? And then if all else fails, just basically have something else happen to them that they can't avoid. As keeper, you have a big bag of tricks that you can throw at players and investigators to get them involved in the plot. But usually if someone isn't engaging with the plot, it's because there's something about it they're either not happy with, it wasn't what they were expecting, or for whatever reason that evening they're just not in the right place to engage with it and deal with it. So as Ken said, talk to your players, find out what's going on.
We have our questioning stalwarts who we're grateful to have joining us every week for these panels. And did we lose Mike Hewell? Looks like we did. James Holloway.
Sorry, I had to find the unmute button. Lynn, you talked earlier about how most Cthulhu gaming scenarios are structured kind of, as mystery scenarios, and of course, investigative horror is kind of the center of the Lovecraft bullseye. But what are some either scenario structures or just like techniques, elements within scenarios that you think are underused, either in published scenarios or in games as they are run?
Ooh, that's a tricky one. Ooh. And this is the point at which my brain dies because it's past my bedtime. I think people, when they're writing for Cthulhu, are often afraid of doing that all-out horror pulp adventure thing. And that is always highly entertaining. I mean, what we're trying to do now with a lot of our bigger campaigns is to make sure that we're putting pulp options in there for people who like that. But yeah, I would like to see a few more people sort of pitching pulp style games, because there's a great deal of fun to be had from pulp games without sacrificing that horror. It can still be truly horrific while you are, running around with your Tommy gun and your bag of explosives.
One thing that I love doing, and was done with great effect in the Raid in Innsmouth, is basically having pre-gens you can hand out to players for specific sections of an adventure. Like I did this one Cthulhu scenario many years ago, which started off on the mountaineering expedition on Everest, and after about an hour of play, 2/3 of the party just get killed by meat or something, or what it was, and the two survivors go on, and the other players get replacement characters, and that's like 3 years later in London. You can basically not script events, but tell a wider story than the tale of these 6 guys going and solving mystery, if you're willing to basically switch up the characters. And because Lovecraft does that a lot in his stories, it feels very Lovecraftian. I mean, Call of Cthulhu is basically 3 separate campaigns, one of which is very short and very messy, and the other 2 are like, the grass in the swamp and a bunch of academics wandering around.
Well, yes, the player in the first one had to leave, and luckily he found the rest of a new group. John Ward, I think you were kicked out, and now you're back.
Yeah, I am. I have sort of the micro version of Paul's question. I'm leading my group into Gumshoe. We played Time Watch and had a lot of fun because the handles for making the characters cool are really close to the handles for the theme of, oh, you were prepared because you put that thing there yesterday, so it would be here today. But in Trail of Cthulhu, I'm a little worried about, on one hand, I want investigative spends to give you concrete results that make you powerful and good at your job, but the whole theme of Cthulhu is sort of there's an unknowable part, and I kind of want some advice about how do you split down the middle there, where you're giving those concrete results, but then also preserving that theme and mystery.
I mean, I think that the immediate key to that is the rhythm that I elucidated in Night's Black Agents, the spy thriller versus vampires game for Gumshoe, which is that information leads to danger, and surviving danger gets you more information. And so if you can make investigative spends as superpowered as you want, most of what information about the Lovecraft universe does is it puts you in position to have something much worse happen to you, or to recognize something much worse is happening. Obviously, interpersonal spends can pay huge dividends. If you burn all 3 of your cop talk points, you don't just talk the sheriff into helping. You've got the whole sheriff's deputy force is out there surrounding the church with floodlights while you go into it and fight near Othotep or whatever. You can, use a credit rating. You spend that, and you've got a really great souped-up car. You can spend into any of those sort of personal things and be a cool, powerful protagonist, TV character within the human world. But of course, that only gets you so far when the Migos show up. And in terms of the academic things where you have knowledge, the knowledge is going to be something like, I spend my architecture. Oh, it's interesting that this house is an exact mirror image of a haunted house that you have read about in Beijing. That's an odd thing for it to be. And so that's a very cool fact to have. That's a nugget of knowledge. Oh, I was in Beijing. I'm very cool. I've been on multiple continents. But now what you know is, oh, this is even worse than I thought. This is a global problem, not just a Arkham, Massachusetts problem. And so the academic spends give you greater knowledge of the problem, which is, I'm not going to say is never good, but it's certainly never unmixed. And then obviously interpersonal or technical spends make them as awesome as you want. You spend all that chemistry, you've made a bunch of bombs. Fine. Just then write in, add 3rd Shoggoth, problem solved, right? You don't have to worry about characters becoming powerful in Cthulhu games because they physically can't. You've only got so many health points or so many stability points, and there's an infinite universe of monsters and horror to ruin things for them.
In the horror genre, any moment of apparent triumph and competence is merely a respite and a setup. So it gives the players time to feel safe and competent and powerful, but as Ken suggests, that is just setting the stage for the rug to be torn out from under them. And particularly in Gumshoe is all about getting information. Well, the number one lesson of Lovecraft is don't get information. Information is the worst because the information is all bad. And, if you manage to get the whole sheriff's department out to help you, well, that just sets you up for the horror of watching as the ghouls tear through the entire sheriff's department, leaving you with the question of how do I tell the authorities that I got all of these people killed, and not to mention the moral, emotional spiral of finding out that you are responsible for that. Michael Kuehl.
Oh, no, I'm on mute. Oh, I was flickering in and out of asking this question because you were covering a lot of what I was concerned about, which is the tension between player agency and nihilism and ultimate helplessness. At the end, you're helpless, but in the meantime, you might have agency. But what I think I came around to thinking about was, is there a default player GM contract in Call of Cthulhu, which people, when they sign up for this sort of game, assume is there? Is there something that's built up in the culture over the years that people assume is going to be part of what the game provides and part of what it guarantees? Is there anything that you're assuming and that your players assume that is common to all the things that are done in all these games?
I think there is a very different expectation with Call of Cthulhu than there is to Dungeons and Dragons, as Ken alluded to earlier. You know, people who know the game, are familiar with it, are familiar with the stories it's based on, know that they're not going to be killing all the things and stealing all their stuff and getting ever more and more powerful. So they're expecting that different game experience, and are open to that, because otherwise, why are they coming along to play it? And I think sometimes where there are problems is because people haven't realized that, and it isn't what they were expecting. Maybe they were expecting just a sort of like a 1920s based kill all the monsters, steal all their stuff experience.
Kill all the monsters, don't steal any of their stuff.
Really don't steal any of their stuff. That's bad.
And I think player expectation differs depending on whether it's a convention game, in which case people are leaning into the idea of we get to fail spectacularly. And the objective perhaps is to stop the summoning of the great entity that will come crushing across the earth. But just as likely, if not more likely, everybody is looking for the opportunity, not right away, but in hour 3, to start being spectacularly obliterated in a fun, memorable way. Whereas in campaign play, people are more likely to get into the idea of, well, I created this character to be semi-disposable, but I've been playing her for 3 sessions now, and I've come to like her and want to preserve her as long as I possibly can. So perhaps she will go out in a heroic blaze of glory, preventing the hideous altar from rising from the swamp. But maybe I do want to keep her going as long as I possibly can, and because I relate to her, I want to see her protected as much as possible. So I think even within the one genre and the one game or the one family of games, the expectation of the players is highly dependent on the number of sessions that you are going to play. So if you know that it's an 8-session game, yeah, you probably mostly, maybe one player wants to be the final gal or final guy, but most people, I think, are perfectly happy to wind up running screeching into the night, if not being eaten by a shoggoth. Whereas in a convention game, I think most people who expect a Cthulhu experience figure, hour 3, all bets are off.
I think
Lovecraft's the source material, there's plenty of characters with agency who achieve, at the very least, local and tactical victories. In Thing on the Doorstep, the Asenath is destroyed and gunned down in the asylum. In Shadow over Innsmouth, Olmsted is lured away by the Call of the Deep Ones, but he does get Innsmouth, dynamited by the feds. Marinus, Dr. Willett defeats Joseph Kerwin and Charles Dexter Ward. The Shunned House is cleansed. The nameless investigator blows up the Martens mansion and all the hideous Martens tunnels underneath it. Story after story after story in Lovecraft, there is a temporary or local victory. And that is the rhythm of gameplay, is that you have these local victories. But again, that victory just reveals to you that you've been in this millennium-long, eon-long struggle that you didn't know about. And yeah, great, you've won the first battle of a decades-long war. Congratulations? ? That's the tension of Lovecraft and the tension of horror in general. And Lovecraft, was a horrorist. He was writing for audiences of adventure fiction, and he was able to balance that out in many of his stories. And even in the ones that end with a note of cosmic nihilism, there is an intellectual victory, as the reader now has an understanding of the Migo or of the great race of Yith, and the reader can be mapped onto the player group. So yeah, you've failed horribly against the Migo in Vermont, but now you understand that there's this monstrous conspiracy, and you can try and think about what to do about all these Bostonians who go to the Himalayas every year, and that's your next question.
And this brings up a question that I thought we might get to, Ken, and I think you're still the top person to field it, which is that Cthulhu and Lovecraft changed gaming, but gaming has also changed our conceptions of what the Lovecraft mythos is. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the ways in which gaming culture has developed the mythos and also changed some of the tropes or expectations surrounding it.
I mean, I think that we've been going around it the whole panel when we talk about the sort of the social contract that if you're playing of Cthulhu, that means you die horribly. And the notion that it's hard to sort of separate that convention-style nihilistic madness where machine gunning everyone in the street might be a completely legitimate thing to do, and the expectations of long-term play. And by and large, though, both of those sets of expectations have filtered back into people's reading of Lovecraft. And so you get people now, and this is not just gaming, I mean, the sort of the one-size-fits-all philosophical critics of Lovecraft do it too, the notion that everything in Lovecraft is bleak and hopeless. It's like everything in Lovecraft is not bleak and hopeless. Every story that happens in Providence has a happy ending, because when it came down to it, Lovecraft didn't want to destroy Providence, Rhode Island, and couldn't bring himself to do it.
Then he would have to move to Chicago. That would be the worst.
God forbid. So that understanding on the one hand, and then on the other hand, there's the sort of nerdification of Lovecraft's universe that, again, was not begun by gamers, was begun by August Derleth and Lynn Carter. But the notion of, if we make a big enough Wikipedia article, we can list all of the gods and all of the monsters and have their home planets and what color they are, and everyone gets a sigil, and it's all going to be, we're going to be like medieval demonologists and just sort everything out. And we know that you do this to call Hastur and this to call Yog-Sothoth, and this is the magic way. And that rationalization, nerdification, structure imposition on Lovecraft is counter to everything Lovecraft wrote. That's the biggest sin that gaming has abetted, I think, against Lovecraft, is the notion that a universe that he wrote specifically to be chaotic and unknowable can be known if you just know enough details about it. That is completely antithetical to Lovecraft. It's completely antithetical to the mythos. But because of gaming, everyone knows that, oh, if you build a magic tower, that's how you get Yog-Sothoth to show up. Or if you say Hastur 3 times, he will come and destroy you. Or lots of other things that are pure gaming myth, but are driven by this desperate urge to codify all of the elements of the universe that is, I think, common to nerd culture in general. I mean, you see it in comics fandom as well, where you have, immense lists of every member of the Avengers or the Justice League or whatever. But it's the notion that the Cthulhu mythos is just a bigger version of the League of Evil Mutants. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what Lovecraft is doing, and I think that's what I tried to do in Trail of Cthulhu by giving all the contradictory versions of the gods, and then in Hideous Creatures presenting all the various weird things you can do to change up the monsters. Lovecraft created these things specifically because he thought vampires and werewolves were too predictable. And so the last thing you want to do is make Pastor and Yog-Sothoth too predictable. That's the opposite of what we want. And the sort of embrace the chaos is been my response to that. Since I did Trail of Cthulhu way back when.
Now, another thing that gaming has added to Cthulhu, not that it was completely absent from Lovecraft, for example, in Herbert West Reanimator, is humor, black humor, often coupled with blackly humorous ultraviolence. And certainly part of that comedy aspect to Lovecraft has been accentuated over the years by Chaosium, which keeps running Cthulhu for president. Lynn, is it going to be redundant this year for Chaosium to run Cthulhu for president again?
Now, if I remember rightly, yeah, I can't honestly see them doing it this year. It's virtually impossible to write and promote satire when real life has completely lost any understanding of what satire actually is. We've taken it in terms of ridiculousness. Yeah, no, I don't think it'll happen this year. I really don't.
Yeah, I don't think Cthulhu will endorse Biden, because that would be taken away.
I have no idea whether he would or not. As you know, American politics in particular is this really strange thing that, as far as I'm concerned, can stay happening to other people. Yeah, it's really odd, isn't it? I mean, the thing you're saying about comedy, black comedy, I have never laughed so much as I have when I've been playing Call of Cthulhu, when I've run Call of Cthulhu, and I think part of that is laughter is a great release of tension in a horror game, but also I think it's part of the shared understanding that we know that it's utterly ridiculous in many ways what we're doing, whilst also being very cathartic at times as well.
So Gar, how much gamer comedy do you like to admit into your Cthulhu game?
I think it's kind of inevitable. I mean, one of the joys of Cthulhu is that the protagonists often aren't like, the right people for the job. They're a bunch of effete academics or eccentrics who are anyone would be in massively over their heads because be at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean with the Mythos. But you have this fantastic contrast of the absolutely minuscule and petty and pedantic versus this cosmic horror. I've never actually played a Cthulhu game where someone hasn't been cracking jokes in or out of character as principally as the horror, or just because the sheer absurdity and the sort of cosmic joke of it all.
So we have one more questioner, Wayne Rossi. Your question.
Okay. Yeah. The one thing I'd like to one of the things I think about with Lovecraft a lot is his entities are kind of not on our moral wavelength. And I was thinking about what Lynn was saying earlier about everything making sense. And I was thinking, and it kind of contrasts to the idea that there's this idiot god Azathoth, sleeping at the center of the universe. And these two ideas, the sort of incomprehensibility and the amorality of the mythos, how do you make that work with plot structures that still work and make sense to people?
So I think one of the keys with that is that although the great old ones are incomprehensible and in fact indifferent, that they are always filtered through human agency, right? That the villain of a Cthulhu story is temporarily, for a moment, is Cthulhu when he's kind of weak, and it's you can momentarily drive a boat through him and it sinks through the waves. But mostly it's cultists and humans who are attempting to use the powers of the mythos for their own ends, and by doing so make them comprehensible and turn indifference of something like Azathoth which, you know, we humans are just completely outside his notice or its notice, and turns it into something where there can be a conventional antagonist, because you know, if you're fighting Asazoth, the scenario is over. He bumps you off. Ken, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that you're absolutely right, Robin, that it's the human foe or the human conduit for the mythos that is the focus of a given scenario. Usually, you in theory could have a sort of we stumble on some kind of horror and it is incomprehensible and baffling and makes no sense, and we're glad to have gotten out of it moment, like a gauntlet, like a you're in Dunwich on Candlemas, and yep, this is when Yog-Sothoth is tangent to Massachusetts, and you just have to survive. That can be a fun, one-off type scenario, but it's not a structure. And what you need to bring into that kind of scenario is knowledge of who the characters are and what they want anyway, and what would make them terrified or make them feel like they're losing their moorings. In terms of the sort of malign idiocy of the rest of the cosmos, that's where the sort of the spoor and the side effects come in. So there's a perfectly understandable human wizard who is using Cthulhuoid magic to get his way because he wants to, run Des Moines, Iowa, or marry the girl that made fun of him in high school, or whatever it is. Totally normal human motive. But the magic that he's using is itself incomprehensible. And so when he puts the whammy on the girl's husband, it also causes a rain of frogs, or it also causes people in one part of the town to lose their memories, or to shift into a different timeline or something else. It's not just like he has a gun and he's shooting somebody. He has a thing he doesn't understand, and he's just sort of opening it and then hoping that at the end what he wants will happen, because he is a true servitor of the old ones. And of course, he's wrong, but he can still do a lot of damage to Des Moines in the process. And even if you're fighting your way through this nest of insanity that he's opened up, it's still that guy, Saul Nicholas, who opened up the jar. And if you can find him and stop him, you can do that. That's the sort of the reasonable human part of it. But the spoor, the echoes, the effects, the side effects, even the real effects, they can be as completely incomprehensible or bananas as your imagination can come up with, and as your table can put up with.
So, Gar, there's sort of an interesting idea that there are some entities that are sort of lesser avatars of the old ones, who, like the spawn of Cthulhu, for example, who are kind of miniature versions of these indifferent gods. How would you create a scenario that has an indifferent antagonist instead of an evil or malign antagonist?
Well, you still need to have a goal for the players to work towards. If it's completely indifferent towards them, and it wants nothing from them, is not even aware of their presence, then the obvious goal there is survival. The players are in close proximity to this awful thing. That's a bad thing, because you don't want to be in close proximity to Cthulhu or whatever, and they need to take action to get out of there. Or you sort of borrow Lovecraft's own plot devices to find the vanishing ritual to get rid of it, or reset the warding stone that has been struck by the earthquake that will rebind it back into its millennial prison. So basically you need to give the players something to do other than make dodge rolls. So you sort of scatter the sandbox with tools they can use to survive, eventually deal with the danger in some way.
So Lynn, how do you help bring in the theme of indifference being different than evil as a major element of the mythos?
You do like to give me really tricky questions when I should be fast asleep in bed, don't you?
You're the special guest. I'm not going to give you the easy questions, Lynn.
Oh, I thought that's what that meant. Damn. I'll remember that next time. Yeah, I mean, as Gar said, when you're dealing with indifference, it's it is this whole thing of like with something evil, it's personal. Whatever they're doing, it's sort of like to spite your investigators, your characters. Whereas if something's indifferent, it's happily going about its plan, and the fact that you happen to get caught up in it is of no never mind to it. It's really not interested. And I think that's what you have to keep in mind if you are trying to have an indifferent antagonist. It's the fact that it isn't personal. It is just doing its thing, and its thing happens to be bad for your investigators. It's not specifically targeting the investigators, whereas something evil and cackling probably would be, because let's face it, if it's evil, it's probably going to cackle and monologue at the investigators at some point.
Yes, Cthulhu doesn't care enough about you to tell you its plan.
Well, precisely.
It's not boastful. Cthulhu, I would dare say, is almost Canadian in his self-effacement.
You want him, you have him.
In that he gets other people to do his dirty work for him.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, I think we've come to the end of our allotted time. If this was a real panel, we would have some people who want to talk about the use of possibly war games in a real military environment, and they're all very serious looking sorts. So they're definitely giving us the side eye from the doorway to our virtual seminar room. So at this point, I'd like to thank all of our questioners and audience members who came to join us and made us feel not so alone in this howling indifferent universe, and to especially thank our panelists, Kenneth Hite, Gareth Hanrahan, and of course our special guest, Lynne Hardy. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming by.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye, everyone. Bye.